The wind that tore across the Wyoming plains in November did not just blow. It hunted. It found every crack in a man's coat. It whistled through the bones of dead trees down by the creek. It reminded a man just how small he was against the vastness of this land. Silas Vance stood by the railing of his corral. His gloved hands rested on the rough pine fence. He was 35 years old, but he looked older. The land had whittled him down to leather and bone. His face was weathered by sun and wind until it matched the color of his worn saddle. He watched his small herd of cattle huddling together against the bitter gusts. They were too thin. Their coats were shaggy and dull. Their breath rose in white clouds like smoke from a dying fire. There should have been more of them. There should have been more hay in the barn. There should have been smoke rising from the bunkhouse chimney where hired hands warmed their fingers before morning work. But the bunkhouse was dark and cold. The door latch had rusted shut months ago. Silas was completely alone. He turned and walked toward his cabin. It was a sturdy structure he had built with his own 2 hands 5 years ago. Back then, hope had been as plentiful as summer grass. Now the cabin felt like a fortress under siege. He stepped inside. The sudden quiet rang in his ears. The air smelled of wood smoke and stale coffee and solitude. On the table sat a ledger open to a page filled with numbers. Silas did not need to look at them. He knew exactly what they said. He owed the bank in town $300 by the 1st of January. He owed the feed store $50, and he had exactly $17 in a tin coffee can on the mantelpiece. Silas sat down heavy on the bench. His joints popped and his left shoulder flared with the old familiar ache. That shoulder was a souvenir from a chaotic battle in Virginia nearly 20 years ago. He had been just a boy wearing a uniform that did not fit. He had seen men torn apart by cannon fire. He had heard boys crying for their mothers in the mud. He came west to forget the noise. He came to find a place where the only sounds were the wind and the work of honest labor. But a man cannot work a ranch this size alone. He needed a partner. He needed hired hands. He needed money. The wind rattled the door like it was trying to get inside. Winter was not coming. Winter was already here, scratching at his threshold. If Silas did not find a solution before the deep snows buried the mountain passes, the bank would take everything. His land, his cattle, his cabin. He would become just another drifter haunted by the ghosts of what he could have built. 2 days later, Silas rode into the town of Ironwood. It was a small collection of buildings clinging to the edge of the railroad tracks. Mud frozen into hard ruts cracked under his horse's hooves. He tied his bay gelding outside the general store and stepped into the warmth. The air inside was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of damp wool. A group of men stood near the pot-bellied stove, laughing loud and harsh. Silas kept his head down. He moved toward the counter to buy a sack of flour and a tin of coffee. He avoided crowds. He avoided making eye contact. But he could not avoid their voices. One man spoke up loud enough for the whole store to hear. He was a thick-necked rancher named Grady, with a reputation for a big mouth and a heavy hand. Grady said, "Did you hear about the freak coming in on the stage today?" Another man chuckled and replied, "I heard. They say she is 7 feet tall if she is an inch, a mountain of a woman." Grady scoffed and said, "Who would marry a thing like that? You would need a ladder to kiss her and a whip to tame her." The men roared with laughter. Silas felt a muscle jump in his jaw. He placed his coins on the counter, counting them out carefully. $1.20. The storekeeper leaned in close. He was a balding man with kind eyes, but a nervous manner. He whispered to Silas. He said, "Do not mind them, Silas. They have nothing better to do than chew on gossip." Silas nodded once and accepted his sack of flour. Then he asked a question that would change everything. He said, "Who is she?" The storekeeper lowered his voice even more. He said, "A broker from Chicago arranged it, brought her out on the train to Cheyenne, then transferred her to the stage. She is a big woman, Silas. They say she was in a show back east. A circus curiosity, no family to speak of. The broker is looking to marry her off to anyone who will take her. He says she comes with a dowry, $500 and a strong back." Silas froze. $500. It was enough to pay the bank, enough to buy feed for winter, enough to hire help come spring. But the thought turned his stomach. To marry a woman for money. to take a stranger into his home simply because he was desperate. It felt wrong in a way he could not name. He walked out of the store into the biting wind. He stood on the boardwalk looking up at the gray sky. He thought about his empty bunkhouse. He thought about the calves that would die without proper feed. He thought about the land that was the only thing he had ever loved. And Silas made a decision that would haunt him for months to come. The stagecoach lurched violently, hitting a rut that sent pain shooting up her spine. Alara sat hunched in the corner of the carriage, her knees pressed tight against her chest because there was nowhere else for them to go. The roof was too low. Her bonnet brushed against the fabric ceiling with every sway of the coach. She was 24 years old, but her eyes held the weariness of a woman 3 times her age. Across from her sat a severe woman with a pinched mouth who clutched her handbag like Alara might snatch it away. The woman stared without shame. Alara was used to stares. She had lived her whole life under them. Step right up. Come and see the Amazonian wonder, the giantess of the north. See the woman who can crush a horseshoe in one hand. The ringmaster's voice echoed in her memory, shrill and grating. For 6 long years she had been a spectacle. She had stood on a wooden platform dressed in a ridiculous costume while men paid 5 cents to gawk at her. They would shout crude things. They would tell her to stand up and turn around and show her teeth. They discussed her measurements like she was a prize heifer at a county fair. 6 feet and 6 inches tall. The ringmaster would shout to the crowd, over 250 pounds of womanly might. Alara had learned to turn into stone during those shows. She fixed her eyes on a spot above their heads and disappeared inside herself. But she made a vow carved into the bedrock of her soul. No one would touch her. They could look, they could mock, they could throw peanuts at her feet. But they would not put their hands on her body. She had broken the wrist of a drunk man in St. Louis who tried to grab her ankle. After that, the ringmaster sold her contract to a broker named Higgins. Higgins told her, "You are too much trouble, girl. Let some rancher deal with you now." So here she was, being delivered like a crate of dry goods. A dowry is what they called the money Higgins paid men to take her off his hands. She was a liability being liquidated. The stagecoach slowed. The driver shouted to the horses. Alara felt a surge of nausea that had nothing to do with the rough ride. This was it, Ironwood, Wyoming, her new cage. She looked out the small window. The town was a dismal smear of brown buildings against white dusted plains. People were already gathering near the stage stop. Of course they were. News of the freak traveled faster than the wind out here. The coach ground to a halt. The door swung open and the driver yelled out. He said, "End of the line, folks." Alara waited for the other passengers to exit first. She needed the space to unfold herself from that tiny compartment. When the carriage was empty, she took a deep breath and steeled herself. She ducked her head low. She maneuvered her broad shoulders through the narrow doorframe, and she stepped down into the frozen mud of Ironwood. A hush fell over the gathered crowd. Alara straightened to her full height. She stood 6 feet and 6 inches tall, towering over every single man on that boardwalk. She wore a plain gray wool dress that had been let out at the seams and a heavy shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She kept her chin high. Her face became a mask of cold indifference. She heard the whispers ripple through the crowd. One woman gasped and said, "Look at the size of her." A man muttered, "It is not natural." Another voice carried clearly, "That is supposed to be a woman." Thought it was a bear standing on hind legs. Alara stared straight ahead, her hands clenched into fists beneath her shawl. Then she saw him. He stood apart from the crowd near a hitching post. A bay horse tossed its head beside him. He was not a big man, maybe 5 feet 10 or 11 inches tall, but he was built lean and hard like a whipcord. He wore a faded canvas coat and a black hat pulled low over his eyes. He was looking at her, but his expression was not mockery. He looked stunned, almost reverent. Silas could not breathe. He had expected something grotesque based on how those men talked in the store. But the woman standing by the stagecoach was not a monster. She was magnificent. Yes, she was vast. Her shadow stretched long across the muddy street. But she carried herself with a silent, terrible dignity. She looked like a queen from a storybook who had lost her kingdom and was walking to her execution. He watched her hands tremble. Just once, a tiny movement invisible to the crowd. But Silas saw it because he knew what it meant. He knew what it was to shake with fear while standing perfectly still. He pushed off the hitching post and walked toward her. The crowd parted for him, sensing that something important was happening. He stopped 3 feet away. He had to tilt his head back to look her in the eye. He said, "Miss Alara." She looked down at him. Her dark eyes searched his face for the cruelty she expected to find. She said, "I am Alara." He said, "I am Silas. The wagon is this way." He did not offer his arm. He sensed somehow that she would not want to be touched. He simply turned and began walking toward his wagon. After a moment of hesitation, he heard the heavy, deliberate crunch of her boots following behind him. And neither one of them knew it yet, but their whole world had just changed forever. The ride to the ranch was torture wrapped in silence. Alara sat on the wagon bench beside Silas. She pressed her thigh against the wooden side to keep as much distance between them as possible. The wagon was old and it rattled violently over the frozen ruts in the road. The sky began to darken from gray to charcoal black. The temperature dropped fast enough to make her bones ache. Silas kept his eyes on the horse's ears. When he spoke, he said, "Are you cold?" She said, "I am fine." It was a lie. Her coat was too thin for this territory. She was freezing down to her marrow, he said. "There is a blanket behind the seat." She said again more sharply, "I said I am fine." She would not accept charity. She would not show weakness. Not until she knew what kind of man she was dealing with. Silas nodded and said nothing more. Coyotes began to sing from the ridges around them. Their yips and howls echoed like mad laughter in the darkness. Alara flinched at the sound. Silas said softly, "Just coyotes. They will not come close." But it was not the animal she feared. It was the silent man beside her. She wondered what he expected in exchange for that $500 dowry. She wondered if she would have to fight him tonight. They arrived at the ranch in pitch darkness. The cabin was a small shadow against the endless black sky. Silas stopped the horses and jumped down from the wagon. He said, "Wait here." He walked ahead and pushed open the cabin door. A moment later, golden light spilled out as he lit a lantern inside. He returned to help her down from the wagon. He extended his hand toward her. Alara ignored it completely. She jumped down on her own. The frozen ground shook slightly under her impact. Silas did not comment on this. He simply led her to the door. The cabin was one room, one large room, maybe 20 feet by 20 feet. Alara's eyes darted around taking inventory. A cast iron stove radiated heat in the corner. A rough wooden table sat in the center with 2 chairs. A wash basin stood near the window. And in one corner was a proper bed with a worn quilt. In the far corner near the door was a pile of rope and a thin mattress made of ticking. Silas gestured toward the bed with the quilt. He said, "That one is yours." Alara looked at him confused. She said, "And where will you sleep?" He said, "I will take the rope bed by the door. I am used to rough sleeping." He moved to the stove and began adding wood to the fire. He kept his back to her the entire time. She watched him with wary eyes. Was this a trick? Some game designed to lower her guard before he showed his true nature? She took off her shawl and folded it precisely. She placed it on the foot of the bed, but she kept her coat on. She felt massive in this tiny space. If she stretched out her arms, she could almost touch both walls. She hunched her shoulders, trying to make herself smaller. "Trying to take up less air," Silas said. "I made a stew before I left for town. It should still be good." He ladled thick beef and potato stew into 2 tin bowls. He cut 2 pieces of bread. He set one bowl on the table and said, "Please sit." Alara sat down carefully. The chair creaked loud under her weight. She flushed red and waited for the joke. Waited for him to say something cruel about not breaking his furniture. Silas did not react at all. He sat down across from her. He bowed his head for a brief moment. Whether in prayer or exhaustion, she could not tell. Then he began to eat. They ate in complete silence. The only sounds were spoons scraping against tin and the wind howling outside like it wanted to tear the roof off. When the meal was finished, Silas stood and gathered the empty bowls. He said, "I will wash up. You have had a long journey. You should rest." Alara stood abruptly. She said, "I can work." That was the deal. Silas paused with his hands in the soapy water. He did not turn around when he answered. He said, Tomorrow there will be plenty of work. Rest now." She retreated to her corner of the room. She turned her back to him and began unbuttoning her dress. Her fingers fumbled with the tiny buttons. She kept her undergarments on, a heavy shift in thick bloomers. She slid under the quilt and pulled it up to her chin. The bed was too short for her, and her feet hung off the end, exposing her ankles to the cold air. She curled her legs up and made herself into a ball. Silas finished washing the dishes. He blew out the lantern. The room plunged into darkness except for the orange glow from the stove vents. She heard the rustle of his clothes as he undressed. She heard the creak of the rope bed as he lay down on the thin mattress near the door. His voice came from the darkness. He said, "Good night, Alara." She did not answer. She lay there staring into the black emptiness. She thought about the circus wagon she used to travel in. That had been a cage on wheels. This cabin was larger, yes, but it was still a cage. And she was still the animal locked inside. She had traded the ringmaster for this quiet, broken cowboy. She wondered when he would demand his money's worth. She wondered if she would have the strength to stop him when he did. Across the room, Silas stared up at the invisible rafters. He could hear her breathing, slow, terrified breaths. He felt a crushing weight settle on his chest. He had done it. He had saved the land, but at what cost? He had brought a stranger into his home. He had signed a paper for another human being like she was livestock. He felt like the kind of man he used to despise. Outside, the snow began to fall. It buried the world in white. It sealed them in together. The next morning, Silas woke before dawn. He dressed quietly and stepped out onto the porch. The temperature had plunged overnight. The cold was so deep, it felt like the air itself might shatter if he breathed too hard. He heard the cabin door open behind him. Ilara stepped out wearing a man's heavy coat that Silas had found in an old trunk. The sleeves barely reached her wrists. She had a wool scarf wrapped high around her neck. She did not shiver. She just stood there looking out at the desolation of the frozen landscape. Silas said, "We need to break the ice on the water trough." She nodded once. She said, "I will get the axe." They walked toward the barn together in silence. 2 weeks passed in this same rhythm. Wake before dawn, work until dark, eat in silence, sleep on opposite sides of the room. Silas had expected a burden. He thought he would spend the winter nursing a frightened city woman who cried at the wind and fainted at the sight of blood. He was wrong. At the water trough on the third morning, Silas reached for the axe. But Alara was already there. She lifted the heavy tool with one hand. The muscles in her arms shifted beneath the thick wool of her coat. She brought the axe down hard. The sound was like a gunshot. Ice cracked and shattered. Water surged up through the fractures, dark and freezing cold. She struck again and again with rhythmic, terrifying power. When she finished, she rested the axe on her shoulder like it weighed nothing at all. She said simply, "Done." Silas stared at the destroyed ice. He had struggled with that same chore yesterday. His bad shoulder had screamed with every swing. He said quietly, "Thank you." She did not look at him. She was already turning toward the barn. She said, "The cattle are hungry." They worked through that morning like a seamless machine. The cattle were thin with their ribs showing through winter coats. Silas pitched hay from the loft while pain radiated down his left arm. Alara carried the grain sacks. These were 100-pound sacks of feed, heavy dead weights that made most men grunt and strain. Silas usually had to drag them across the dirt. Alara bent her knees. She gripped the burlap. She hoisted a sack onto her shoulder in one fluid motion. Then she walked to the troughs with steady strides and poured the grain without a single tremor in her hands. Silas paused, leaning on his pitchfork. He watched her work. It was not just strength, it was efficiency. She did not waste energy on unnecessary movements. She worked like someone who had spent a lifetime doing hard physical labor. But it was later that morning while checking the horses that Silas saw something else entirely. His bay gelding was skittish from the cold. The horse tossed his head with eyes rolling white. Silas reached for the halter, but the horse jerked away and snapped its teeth. Silas said, "Easy, boy." Laura moved past him into the stall. She did not shrink away from the panicked animal. Her massive frame filled the entire space. The horse froze. Its ears flickered nervously. Ilara laid her large hand on the horse's neck just behind the ear. She began to hum. It was a low thrumming sound, more vibration than melody. She stroked the coarse hair. Her touch was impossibly light for hands that could crush bone. She murmured softly to the beast. She said, You are just cold. You are just tired of the wind. I know. I understand. The horse lowered its head. It blew out a long breath and leaned its weight against her chest. She stood there, absorbing the animal's fear into her own solid body. Silas watched from the barn aisle. Forgotten. He felt a strange tightness in his throat. He had seen men break horses with whips and spurs. He had never seen anyone calm one just by being solid and still. He said, "You have a way with them." Alara stiffened immediately. She pulled her hand away and stepped back. Her shoulders curled inward like she had been caught doing something forbidden. She said defensively, "I grew up around animals. In the show, the elephants liked me." Silas followed her out into the blinding daylight. He said, "It is more than that. You work harder than any hand I ever hired, and you are gentler than any of them too." Alara stopped walking. She turned and looked down at him. Her dark eyes went wide with shock. She was waiting for the punchline, waiting for him to add the cruel words, "For a freak, for a monster." But Silas only adjusted his hat against the sun. He pointed toward the fence line in the distance. He said, "That north section needs mending before the next snow comes." Then he walked away. Alara watched him go. A warmth that had nothing to do with the winter sun bloomed in her chest. She crushed it down immediately. Hope was dangerous. Compliments were usually bait for a trap. But as she picked up the coil of wire, she replayed his words in her mind. She hoarded them like gold coins hidden in a secret place. The boundaries in that cabin were as solid as the log walls. They lived in a space no larger than 20 feet by 20 feet. Yet somehow they maintained a distance of miles between them. Silas had rigged up a blanket on a rope to partition off the corner where Alara's bed stood. When she needed to change or wash, she would say the word, "Turn," and he would go outside or busy himself at the stove with his back completely turned. He never crossed into her space, not once. At night, the darkness filled with the sounds of their separate existences, the rustle of straw, the shift of a body trying to get comfortable, the slow rhythm of breathing. They did not touch. When they passed tools to each other, they gripped opposite ends. When they sat at the small table to eat, they kept their elbows tucked in close to their bodies. Lara felt her size like a sin every moment of every day. She tried to make herself small. She hunched her spine. She kept her legs tucked under the chair. Silas felt his own gaze like a weapon. He caught himself watching her sometimes. The curve of her neck, the power in her wrists as she kneaded bread. He would force his eyes to the floor, consumed by guilt. But slowly something began to change. The silence between them shifted texture. It transformed from the tense silence of strangers into the companionable silence of survivors. Small rituals formed between them like frost crystals on a window pane. Every dawn, before the work began, Silas would brew coffee strong enough to strip paint off wood. He would pour 2 tin cups and set hers on the table without a word. They would stand there drinking the scalding liquid, watching the gray light seep through the cracks in the shutters. He would ask, "Ready?" She would answer, "Ready." It was the only vow they had actually made to each other. In the evenings, if the wind died down, they would sit together on the porch bench. The sunset over the mountains was always violent, purple and crimson bruising across the sky. They never spoke of the beauty. They just witnessed it together. One afternoon, the crack of a rifle echoed from a distant ridge, a hunter tracking elk somewhere miles away. Silas was repairing a bridle inside the barn when he heard it. He dropped the leather strap. His body went rigid. His eyes blew wide and vacant, staring at nothing. He was back in Virginia, back in the smoke and the screaming. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. His hand flew to the old wound on his left shoulder. Ilara saw it happen. She was holding a lantern near the door. She did not speak. She did not try to touch him. She simply moved her large body between Silas and the barn entrance. She blocked his view of the ridge outside. She created a wall of safety with her own flesh and bone. She said in that low humming voice she used for frightened horses. She said, "It is just a hunter, Silas, just a hunter. We are here, we are safe." He blinked several times. The terror slowly drained from his face. It was replaced by a gray, heavy shame. He looked at her and saw her solidity. He saw her standing there like a mountain that could not be moved. He whispered, "I know." I know. Days later, it was her turn. They were working in the barn when the wind carried the sound of men laughing from the road outside. Just travelers passing by, shouting some joke to one another. Ilara flinched like she had been struck across the face. She dropped the curry brush she was holding. She backed into the corner of the stall, her arms crossed over her chest. Her eyes darted frantically toward the door. Her breathing turned shallow and fast. She made herself as small as she could, terrified, expecting the door to burst open, expecting the pointing fingers and the jeering faces. Silas walked calmly to the barn door and looked outside. He watched the riders disappear over the hill. Then he turned back to face her. He said firmly, "They are gone. They were not looking at us." Alara stared at him. Her chest was heaving. She looked like a trapped animal ready to bolt. Silas understood something in that moment. He realized that her scars were not visible on her skin. He realized that laughter was to Alara what gunfire was to him. He thought to himself, "We are a fine pair, two broken things trying to build a whole life." The change came gradually like spring thaw. One morning, Silas was shaving by the wash basin. He had his shirt off. The scars on his shoulder were silvery white in the gray light coming through the window. Alara was kneading dough at the table. She looked up and her eyes lingered on him. She watched the razor glide carefully over his throat. She studied the line of his jaw, the vulnerability of his exposed neck. When he rinsed the blade and turned around, she looked down quickly. Color rose in her cheeks. Another evening, Alara sat by the fire braiding her long dark hair. She swept the heavy mass over one shoulder. The movement exposed the nape of her neck, pale and soft in the firelight. Silas was mending a harness across the room. His hands went still. He traced the curve of her neck with his eyes. He imagined the weight of her hair, the warmth of her skin. A sudden sharp hunger rose in him that had nothing to do with food. He forced himself to look away. His heart hammered against his ribs. They were dancing on the edge of a cliff, and both of them knew it. The boundary finally cracked on a Tuesday night. The wind had died down, leaving a silence so deep it rang in the ears. They were standing by the stove. Alara had just poured the last of the coffee into his cup. As she pulled her hand back, her fingers brushed against his. It was an accident, a clumsy mistake of space. But neither of them pulled away. Her hand rested against his knuckles, large and calloused and warm. Silas stopped breathing. The contact sent a shock through his body that was almost painful. He looked at their touching hands. Then he looked up at her face. Alara was staring at him. Her lips were slightly parted. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. She did not retreat. She did not hunch her shoulders or try to disappear. She stood at her full height. Her hand lingered on his for 10 seconds that stretched into eternity. The heat of the stove was nothing compared to the heat rising between them. Then a log shifted in the firebox. A loud pop shattered the silence. Alara gasped and jerked her hand back like she had been burned. She turned away, grabbing a dish rag. She began scrubbing a spot on the table that was already clean. Silas stood there with his hands still tingling. He stared at her back. He said nothing. But as he looked at her, he knew something had changed forever. He was no longer just a lonely man trying to save a ranch. He was a man falling in love. And he was terrified of what that meant. But the world outside their cabin had not forgotten about them. The poison started in town and spread outward like infection. Harlan Boyd was not a man who let a grudge die of natural causes. He was the wealthiest rancher in the valley, big in the gut and heavy in the face. He wore a fur-lined coat that smelled of money and arrogance. He had always looked down on Silas as a failure, a man who could not hold his own. And now Silas had that giant freak woman living on his property. It was an insult to everything Harlan believed about the natural order of things. So Harlan talked, loud and often, in the warm belly of the saloon. He told anyone who would listen that Silas Vance had bought himself a circus animal. He made crude jokes about what happened in that cabin at night. He speculated about whether she slept in the barn with the horses because she could not fit through the door. The stories grew uglier with each telling, and then Harlan decided that talking was not enough. One night, Silas and Alara were eating a cold supper of cornbread and salted pork. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken things. Suddenly, the dog outside started barking. Not the warning bark of a visitor approaching. This was the frantic, snarling bark of real danger. Silas was out of his chair instantly. He grabbed the Winchester rifle from where it hung on the wall. He said, "Stay here," she said. "I'm coming with you," he said. I said, "Stay here." She ignored him completely. She grabbed the lantern and followed him outside onto the porch. The night was pitch black, moonless. The wind whipped the lantern flame around wildly. There was no one there, but they could hear hoofbeats, galloping horses already fading down the road into darkness. Silas walked to the gate with the lantern held high. He stopped cold. Nailed to the wooden gatepost were 3 dead jackrabbits. Their bodies were stiff and bloody. They hung by their ears in a grotesque display. Beside them, words had been painted on the wood in red axle grease. "Monster. Coward. Get out." Silas stared at the rabbits. The violence of the message was visceral. It was a promise of worse things to come. He heard Alara make a sound behind him, a small strangled gasp. He turned. She was staring at the word monster. Her arms wrapped around her stomach. She was rocking slightly on her feet. She whispered, "Take it down. Please take it down." Silas ripped the dead rabbits from the post. He threw them into the darkness. He tried to scrub the painted words away with his glove, but the grease only smeared. It looked like fresh blood. He said, "Go inside, Alara." She turned and ran back to the cabin. He heard the door slam shut behind her. Silas stood alone in the yard. Rage burned through his veins, hotter than any fire. Harlan Boyd had just made a very serious mistake. The fight that erupted inside the cabin that night was brutal in its honesty. When Silas came back inside, he barred the door behind him. He turned to find Alara standing by the table. Her face was wet with tears. Her body trembled so hard the floorboards vibrated beneath her feet. She screamed at him. "Why did you not shoot them? Why did you let them do this?" he said. "They were gone before I got there." She cried. "You let them paint that word on our home." He said, "I cannot stop the wind, Alara, and I cannot stop men like Harlan Boyd from being cruel." She stepped toward him. Her grief made her look formidable despite her tears. She towered over him in the small space. She said, "You are hiding things from me. You hide the letters that come. You hide the bills. You hide your past. That man Harlan shouted things in town about you killing someone, about a girl who died." "Is it true?" Silas flinched like she had slapped him. He said through gritted teeth, "It was an accident, years ago. I never meant for it to happen," she said. "But you never told me. Just like you never told me we are completely broke. Just like you never told me that broker Higgins is writing letters to you." Silas exploded. He yelled, "I am trying to handle it. I am trying to keep this ranch from falling apart. I am trying to keep a roof over your head." She yelled back, "I do not need a roof. I need the truth. Are you sending me away?" "Is that what the letter said?" "Are you selling me back to him?" he shouted. "No," she demanded. "Then what?" He ran his fingers through his hair, pacing like a caged animal. He said, "Higgins wants more money. He says the contract has changed. If I do not pay another $200, he will come for you. He called you." He stopped himself. She asked very quietly, "He called me what?" Silas looked at her. He saw the trap he had walked into. He saw the hurt already forming in her eyes. He whispered, "He called you merchandise. He said if I do not pay, he will reclaim the collateral." Alara stood completely still. She repeated the word. "Merchandise," he said. "It is just words, Alara. Lawyer words, legal language." She said, "No, it is what I am, to him and to you," he said desperately. "That is not true." He stepped forward, reaching for her hand. She snatched it away. She hissed, "Do not touch me." Her voice broke as she continued. She said, "You bought me Silas. You paid $500. Now you have to pay 200 more or give me back. I am just a bad investment, a piece of farm equipment that eats too much and brings trouble," he said. Alara stopped. She said, "I bet you wish you could return me. I bet you look at that letter and wish you had never signed that paper. You are ashamed of me. You hide me away here. You do not touch me. You do not even look at me when you think I might notice." He said, I look at you every single day." She screamed, "You look at a freak." The word hung in the air between them. Silas stared at her, breathing hard. He saw the wall she had built slamming back into place. He saw the lonely, terrified girl hiding inside the giant body. He said softly, "I look at my wife," but she was already gone. She turned her back on him and walked to the dark corner of the room. She sat on her bed and pulled her knees up to her chest. She turned her face to the wall. She said, "Leave me alone. Just leave me alone." Silas stood there helpless. His heart was bleeding inside his chest. He wanted to go to her. He wanted to explain that he avoided touching her because he was afraid of scaring her. Not because she was a freak, but the distance between them felt like a canyon that could not be crossed. He sat down at the table and put his head in his hands. He must have dozed off from exhaustion because he woke to a sound that was not the wind. It was crackling, like paper being crumpled, but louder. And there was a smell, not the pleasant smell of their wood stove. This was the bitter, choking stench of burning pine tar. Silas jerked his head up. The window facing the barn was glowing orange. Fire. He scrambled to his feet, knocking the chair over. He shouted, "Elara, the barn is on fire." She was already moving. She was out of bed with her boots in her hand. She shoved her feet into them without lacing and grabbed her coat. They burst out of the cabin into a nightmare. The barn was fully engulfed. The dry hay in the loft had caught like kindling. Flames licked up the walls, reaching for the roof. The wind fanned the fire and turned the whole structure into a roaring furnace. Inside the burning building, the horses were screaming, high, shrill sounds of pure animal terror. Silas yelled, "Get the water buckets!" Elara shouted back, "No, there is no time for water. Get the animals out." She ran straight at the burning building. Silas screamed, "Lara!" She did not stop. She threw her shoulder against the barn doors. They were barred from the outside. Someone had jammed a heavy piece of wood into the latch. Arson. It was undeniable now. This was no accident. Elara roared with effort and slammed her body against the wood again. The bar splintered into pieces. The doors flew open. Black smoke billowed out, thick and choking. Silas ran in after her, wrapping his scarf around his face. The heat was a physical blow that nearly knocked him backward. He shouted, "Get the horses!" Elara was already there. The bay gelding was rearing up, kicking at the stall door. Its eyes rolled white with panic. Elara did not flinch. She grabbed the halter with her massive hands. She forced the animal's head down, using strength that would shame most men. She shouted over the roar of the fire, "Go! Move!" She dragged the horse out into the snow and smacked its rump hard. The animal bolted toward the pasture. She turned back instantly. The roof groaned above them. A beam that had been eaten by fire was sagging down toward them. Silas shouted, "The milk cow is trapped!" He was struggling with the gate of the cow pen. The metal latch was burning hot. Elara was beside him in a second. She ripped the entire gate off its hinges with her bare hands. She grabbed the terrified cow by the horns and physically shoved the animal toward the door. She yelled, "Get out, Silas. The roof is coming down," he said. "I have to get my saddle. My rifle is in the tack room," she screamed. "Leave it." Silas did not listen. He ran toward the back of the barn where the tack room was located. He grabbed his saddle. It was heavy with expensive leather. As he turned to run, a burning rafter thick as a man's waist sheared off from the ceiling above him. Elara saw it happening. She lunged forward. She could not reach him in time to stop the beam from falling, but she reached him in time to shove him sideways. She hit him with her shoulder and knocked him out of the beam's path. The timber crashed down. It missed, crushing his skull by inches. But the end of the beam clipped his head hard. Then it landed across his legs. Sparks showered over him. The heat seared his hands as he tried to push the burning wood away. He screamed in agony. Lara was there. She did not hesitate for even a second. She grabbed the burning beam with her gloved hands. The leather smoked and blackened. She gritted her teeth. The veins in her neck bulged with effort. With a primal heave, she lifted the massive timber off his legs. She threw it aside like it weighed nothing. Then she grabbed Silas by the back of his coat. She hauled him up like he was a small child. She half carried and half dragged him toward the door. They fell out into the snow just as the rest of the roof collapsed behind them. A geyser of sparks shot up into the black sky, illuminating the devastation. They scrambled away on hands and knees, coughing violently. The heat was still intense enough to singe their eyebrows even from 20 yards away. They collapsed in a snowbank and watched the barn burn down to nothing. Everything was gone. The winter feed was gone. The tools were gone. The shelter was gone. But the horses were alive. They huddled by the corral fence, shivering but breathing. The cow stood nearby, bewildered but safe. Silas lay on his back, gasping for air. His head was spinning. Blood trickled into his eye from a gash on his forehead. His hands were burned and blistering. Lara sat up slowly. She wiped soot from her face and looked at him. Her eyes were wide and white against her blackened skin. She asked, "Are you alive?" He nodded weakly. He said, "Thanks to you," and in that moment something shifted between them. The walls did not just crack, they began to crumble completely. The walk back to the cabin was a limping march of the defeated. Inside, the air felt impossibly cold after standing near that inferno. Alara lit the lantern with shaking hands. The adrenaline was fading from her body now. Reality was setting in. She said, "Sit down." Silas sat on the edge of her bed. He was shivering violently. Shock was setting in fast. Alara moved with efficient purpose. She brought a basin of water and a clean cloth. She knelt down between his knees. She said, "Let me see your hands." He held them out. The palms were red and blistered. Angry burns striped across the skin. She hissed through her teeth at the sight. She took a jar of salve from the shelf. It was bear grease mixed with healing herbs. She began to apply it carefully. Her touch was agonizingly gentle. Her large fingers moved over his damaged skin with a delicacy that made his breath catch in his throat. He looked down at her. Her hair had come loose from its braid. It fell in a dark curtain around her face. She smelled of smoke and sweat and honest labor. It was the most real smell he had ever known. He watched her face as she worked. Her brow was furrowed in concentration. She was biting her lower lip. A smudge of ash darkened her cheekbone. He said quietly, "Alara." She looked up. Their faces were inches apart. He said again, "You saved my life." She looked back down at his hands. She said, "You are a fool." "Going back for a saddle," he said. "It was not about the saddle. It was about the rifle. It belonged to my father," she said fiercely. "You are worth more than a gun, Silas." The words hung between them. She froze. She realized what she had just said. Silas leaned forward. The pain in his hands was completely forgotten now. All he could feel was the magnetic pull of her presence. The heat from the fire still hummed in his blood. The nearness of death had stripped away all pretense. He wanted her. Not as a nurse, not as a worker. He wanted her as a woman. Alara saw it in his eyes. She saw the hunger there. For a moment, her own desire flared bright. A desperate, aching need to be held, to be comforted after the terror of this night. Her hand lingered on his wrist. Her breathing hitched. But then the memory of the letter crashed back into her mind. Merchandise, collateral. She pulled her hands away abruptly. She said with a trembling voice, "I will bandage these. Then you need to sleep," he said. "Alara, please." "We need to talk," she said. "There is nothing to talk about. The barn is gone. The hay is gone. You have no way to pay Higgins now," he said desperately. "I will find a way. I will sell the saddle. I will sell the bay horse," she asked. "And if it is not enough, if he comes with the sheriff to take me away, will you fight them, Silas? Or will you cut your losses?" he said. "I would never let them take you." She turned to face him. Tears stood bright in her eyes. She said, "You might not have a choice, and I cannot live my life waiting for the day you decide I cost too much to keep." She finished bandaging his hands in silence. The intimacy of the moment before was gone. Cold reality had replaced it. Later that night, Silas lay in his bed. The pain in his head throbbed in rhythm with his heartbeat. He listened to Alara breathing across the room. It was ragged, uneven. She was awake too. He wanted to cross the floor. He wanted to crawl into her bed and wrap his arms around her. He wanted to tell her that she was the only thing on this earth that mattered to him. But he was paralyzed by his own failures. He had failed to protect the herd. He had failed to protect her reputation. He had failed to be honest with her. He felt he had lost any right to touch her. Alara lay staring at the ceiling. The smell of smoke was still in her hair. She felt trapped. The fire had been a message from the town. "You are not welcome here." The letter from Higgins was a message from the world. "You are property." She felt the walls of the cabin closing in around her. She felt the heavy weight of debt like a chain locked around her ankle. She could not do it. She could not wait to be sold. She could not wait to be discarded. Slowly and silently she sat up. She swung her legs out of bed. She picked up her boots but did not put them on. She did not want the sound of footsteps to wake him. She walked to the door. She opened it with agonizing slowness. The latch clicked softly. She stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit her like a physical slap. It stole the breath from her lungs. She stepped down into the snow. She was barefoot. The ice burned the soles of her feet, a sharp, clarifying pain. She walked 10 paces away from the cabin. She stood under the vast, star-cluttered sky. The ruins of the barn were a smoldering black scar on the white snow. The smell of wet ash hung heavy in the frozen air. She looked up at the stars, cold, indifferent, beautiful. She wrapped her arms around herself. Her fingers dug into her own ribs. She whispered to the wind, "I am not merchandise." She looked back at the cabin, at the window where Silas lay wounded and sleeping. A tear froze on her cheek. She whispered fiercely, "I will not be owned. I will not be a bargain. I will not be collateral." She shivered violently. Her feet were going numb in the snow. She thought about walking away, walking into the mountains, walking until her feet bled, walking until she was free or dead. But she looked at that small cabin one more time, and she made a decision. Not because she was weak, but because she was not done fighting yet. She would give him one more chance. Just one. She slipped back inside. The door clicked shut behind her like the closing of a book. The next morning brought a different kind of storm. They were still surveying the damage from the fire when riders appeared on the road. There were 4 of them. Harlan Boyd rode in front on a massive black stallion. Behind him came the sheriff, looking deeply unhappy, and 2 men in city suits who looked like they belonged in a bank, not a barnyard. Silas walked to the gate, his face hardened into stone. Elara came out of the cabin. She stood on the porch watching. Harlan called out, well, look who survived the night." "I heard you had some excitement out here, Vance," Silas said flatly. "What do you want, Harlan?" Harlan smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. He said, "I am here to facilitate a business transaction. This here is Mr. Thornton from the bank in Laramie, and his associate. They have some papers you need to see." The banker stepped down from his horse. He held a stack of documents. He said in a dry, dusty voice, "Mr. Vance, we hold the note on your mortgage. We also purchased the outstanding debt from a Mr. Higgins in Chicago regarding a personal loan arrangement." Silas felt the blood drain from his face. He said, "You bought the note from Higgins," the banker said. "We did, and as of this morning you are in default. The total amount due including interest is $340, Silas said. "I have until spring to pay the mortgage." That was the original agreement. The banker said, "The terms allow for immediate recall if the collateral is deemed at risk. The fire last night depreciated the value of this property significantly. We are foreclosing." Silas looked at the sheriff. He said, "John, is this legal?" The sheriff would not meet his eyes. He stared at the ground. He said quietly, "They have the paperwork, Silas. I checked it. It is airtight." Harlan was grinning now like a cat with a mouse under its paw. He said, "Now hold on. There might be an alternative here." "I am a generous man, Silas. I hate to see a neighbor thrown out in the snow," Silas asked. "What alternative?" Harlan said. "I am willing to cover the debt, all of it. I will pay off the bank. I will even pay off that broker in Chicago," Silas said. "And in exchange," Harlan said, "in exchange, I take the land. You can stay on as a tenant, work the herd. But the deed comes to me," Silas asked. "What else?" Harlan's eyes slid toward the porch, toward Elara standing there tall and still. He said, "And her. I need a housekeeper. My place is big, lots of heavy lifting. She can work off the interest at my ranch, cooking and cleaning and entertaining." Elara walked down off the porch. Her stride was long and angry. She demanded, "What did you just say?" Harlan smiled up at her. "That wet, ugly smile," he said. "I said, come live with me, darling. I will put you to work proper." Silas moved fast. His hand dropped to the pistol at his hip. The sheriff raised his shotgun. He barked, "Do not do it, Silas." "There are 4 of us." Silas froze with his hand hovering over his gun. He was shaking with rage. Harlan said calmly, "It is a business offer, Vance. Take it or leave it. If you refuse, the bank takes the land today. You will both be out by sunset with nothing but the clothes on your backs." Elara walked up to the fence. She looked Harlan straight in the eye. She was taller than him, even with him sitting on that horse. She said, I would rather freeze to death in a ditch than spend 1 hour under your roof. Harlan's smile disappeared. He said coldly, "Have it your way, freak." He turned to the banker. He said, "Serve the papers." The banker stepped forward and shoved documents into Silas's hands. He said, "You have 24 hours to vacate or pay the full amount. Those are your only options." They turned their horse and rode away. Harlan looked back once. His eyes were full of ugly promises. Silas stood holding the papers. $340. It might as well have been $1 million. Ilara's voice was barely a whisper. She said, "He wants to separate us. He wants to own me," Silas said. "He will never have you. I will burn this ranch to the ground before I let him touch you," she said. "But we have nothing, Silas. No barn, no money, no way out." Silas looked at the sky. Storm clouds were building over the mountains, dark and heavy and full of menace. He said, "I will ride to town. I will talk to the other ranchers. Maybe someone will lend us the money." Ilara grabbed his arm. She said, "Look at the sky. A blizzard is coming. It is suicide to ride out now." He pulled away from her. He said, "It is our only chance." He ran to saddle the bay horse. His burned hands screamed with pain, but he ignored it. Ilara watched him with dread pooling in her stomach. She said, "Silas, please." He swung up into the saddle and looked down at her. He said, "I will be back. I promise. I will fix this." He spurred the horse and galloped out of the yard. Ilara stood alone, watching him disappear over the ridge. She looked at the storm clouds rolling in from the mountains. She had a terrible feeling she would never see him alive again. The blizzard did not arrive like normal weather. It arrived like judgment from an angry god. By 2 in the afternoon, the sky turned the color of a bruise, heavy and suffocating. By 3, the wind began to scream, a high, thin shriek that vibrated in the teeth and bones. By 4, the world disappeared completely. The snow did not fall. It flew sideways. It slashed at the cabin walls like buckshot fired from a gun. The temperature dropped so fast the logs popped and groaned as they shrank in the sudden freeze. Ilara paced the length of the small room. 4 steps one way, 4 steps back. She stopped at the window and scraped a circle in the frost that had formed on the inside of the glass. She saw nothing but swirling, gray and white. Silas had been gone for 6 hours now. The ride to town was 2 hours in good weather. Even if he had stopped to talk to every rancher in the valley, he should have been back before the storm hit. Anxiety was a cold stone in her stomach. She imagined him on the road. She imagined his horse stumbling into a drift. She imagined Harlan Boyd waiting for him somewhere along the way. The light faded from gray to suffocating black. The wind howled down the chimney, blowing smoke back into the room. A voice whispered in her head, a voice that sounded like the ringmaster from the circus. The voice said, "He is not coming back. He has left you, or he is dead." Ilara grabbed her coat. It was the heavy canvas one that Silas had traded for. It smelled like him, tobacco and leather and honest sweat. She buttoned it all the way to her chin. She wrapped a thick wool scarf around her head, covering her ears and nose. She pulled on leather gloves. She did not think about the danger. She did not think about the fact that men died 10 feet from their own doors in storms like this. She only thought about the silence where his heartbeat should be. She lit the hurricane lantern. She shielded the flame inside her coat. She pushed the cabin door open. The wind hit her like a fist. It staggered her backward. She lowered her shoulder and pushed out into the white chaos. She fought the door shut behind her. Then she made her way to the shelter they had built for the animals. The old plow horse, Bessie, stood in the corner. A massive gray mare with a calm disposition. Ilara grabbed the saddle. It was heavy and stiff with cold. She threw it onto Bessie's back with a grunt of effort. She did not bother with a metal bit. It would tear the horse's mouth in this freeze. She used a rope hackamore instead. She mounted up. The shelter creaked under their combined weight. She turned the mare into the wind. She shouted, "Find him, Bessie! Find him!" They moved into the white void. The road was just a memory now. Ilara guided the horse by instinct. She watched for the faint outlines of fence posts poking up through the drifts. The wind tried to push them off the path. It shoved against Ilara's broadside like a giant invisible hand. She leaned into it using her seat as ballast. They rode for an hour. It felt like 10. Ilara's eyelashes froze together. Her hands became numb blocks of wood. Her face burned from the ice crystals pelting her skin. Then Bessie shied hard. The horse nearly threw her off. Alara peered down through the swirling snow. A fence post lay shattered on the ground. The wire was snapped and coiling in the wind like a wounded snake. Beside it, half buried in a drift, was a dark shape. A hat. Alara's heart stopped. She slid from the saddle, sinking to her waist in the snow. She fought her way to the object. It was Silas's hat. The brim was crushed, and beside it was a smear of darkness that was not dirt. It was red, bright frozen red. Blood. Panic exploded in her chest. She scrambled back to the horse and hauled herself up. She screamed into the wind. Silas. The storm swallowed his name. She kicked the mare forward, forcing the animal through drifts that reached its chest. They reached the creek crossing. The water was frozen over, a jagged scar of ice cutting through the white landscape. On the far bank was a mound, a horse-shaped mound, motionless. Alara drove Bessie across the ice. The bay gelding was down. Its leg was twisted at a sickening angle. The horse was dead. Its body was already stiffening. And beside it, huddled in the lee of the dead animal, was a smaller mound. Alara threw herself off the mare. She fell into the snow and crawled the last few feet on hands and knees. She dug frantically, tossing scoop after scoop of white powder aside until she found wool. Silas. He was curled into a ball. His arms were wrapped around his head. He was covered in snow. His coat was stiff with ice. Alara grabbed his shoulder and rolled him over. His face was a mask of blood and blue bruises. His eyes were closed. His lips were the color of a winter sky. She slapped his cheek hard. She shouted, "Wake up, Silas! Wake up!" He groaned. It was weak and pitiful. But it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. She did not waste time checking for broken bones. If she left him here, he would die. She grabbed him under the arms. He was dead weight, limp and heavy. She planted her feet in the shifting snow. She roared with effort, a sound of pure defiance against the storm. And she lifted him. She dragged him toward Bessie. The mare danced nervously, eyeing the body. Alara commanded, "Stand." She hefted Silas up, using every ounce of strength she possessed. Her back screamed, her muscles burned. But she shoved him over the saddle, balancing him on his stomach like a sack of grain. She scrambled up behind him. She grabbed his coat to keep him from sliding off. She said, "Go home, Bessie, take us home." The ride back was a blur of white terror. Alara held Silas against her chest. She tried to share her warmth with him, but he was like a block of ice. He murmured strange things, names she did not recognize, places she had never been. The wind struck them from all sides, blinding and disorienting. Alara buried her face against his back. She trusted the horse. She trusted the instinct that pulled them toward shelter. When the cabin finally appeared through the swirling white, she began to weep. She slid off the horse and pulled Silas down into her arms. She kicked the door open, shouting until the latch gave way. She dragged him inside and slammed the door against the screaming wind. The sudden silence was shocking. Alara dropped to her knees. She pulled Silas close to the stove. She said, "Can you hear me, Silas?" He did not answer. She stripped off his frozen clothes. Her fingers were clumsy and slow. She used a knife to cut his bootlaces. His feet were white as marble. She stripped him down to his long underwear, which was soaked through with sweat and melted snow. She dragged the mattress from her bed and placed it right next to the stove. She rolled him onto it. She piled every blanket they owned on top of him. She heated bricks on the stone and wrapped them in towels and tucked them around his body. She boiled water. She washed the blood from his face. He had a deep gash on his forehead. His ribs were covered with dark bruises, the shape of a boot heel. She hissed through her teeth. She said, "Harlan did this to you." Silas began to thrash beneath the blankets. The heat was hitting him, waking his frozen nerves. He mumbled, "Stay down. Watch the flank." She stroked his hair. She said, "You are safe. You are home," he said. "I lost the money, Alara. They took it. I lost everything," she said. "I do not care about the money. You are alive. That is all that matters." His eyes flew open. They were wild and unfocused. He looked at her face. Her skin was still blackened from smoke. Her eyes were red and terrified. He whispered, "Alara," she said, "I am here." He tried to sit up, but groaned with pain and fell back. He said, My head, my ribs. She said, "You were beaten. Harlan's men ambushed you." He closed his eyes, he said. "They were waiting at the creek. 4 of them. They said the payment was due." Alara's hands went still on his bandages. She looked at his battered face. He had ridden into a trap because of her. He had taken a beating that was meant to break both of them. And in that moment, something shifted inside her heart. The last wall came crumbling down. The storm raged outside for 2 more days. They were trapped together in that small cabin, sealed in by snow drifts that climbed halfway up the door. No sheriff was coming. No neighbor could reach them. They were completely alone in a white universe. And in that isolation, they finally began to speak the truth. On the second night, Silas was strong enough to sit up. His ribs still ached. His head still throbbed. But the color had returned to his face. They sat together by the stove. Alara had made coffee, strong and black. She poured generous splashes of whiskey into both cups. She said, "For the aches." He took the cup. Their fingers touched. Neither one pulled away. Silas said, "Harlan was telling the truth about the killing years ago." Alara looked at him steadily. She said, "Tell me." He took a long breath. He said, "It was in Abilene, 5 years back. I was working security for a cattle drive. Harlan's younger brother Caleb was there. He was a mean drunk, always looking for a fight. He stared into the fire. He said, one night Caleb cornered a girl in the saloon, a serving girl. She could not have been more than 18 years old. He had a knife. He was hurting her. His hands gripped the cup until his knuckles went white. He said, I tried to talk him down. I told him to let her go. He lunged at her with the blade, so I drew my gun." He paused. The fire popped in the stove. He said, "I aimed for his shoulder. I just wanted to stop him. But he spun her around, boy. He used her body as a shield just as I pulled the trigger." Alara reached out and covered his hand with hers. He said, "The bullet went through her, hit him too. They both died. Caleb died fast. The girl, she took a long time. I held her while she bled out on the floor. She asked me why I did it, why I shot her. Tears ran down his weathered cheeks," he said. "I have never forgotten that. The weight of the gun in my hand, the way it felt to end a life I was trying to save. That is why I came out here. That is why I live alone. I am terrified of what my hands can do when I lose control." He looked at her with raw eyes. He said, "That is why I have been so careful with you, Alara. It is not because you are different. It is because I am dangerous." Alara set her cup down. She turned her whole body to face him. She said, "You are not dangerous, Silas. You are wounded. There is a difference." She took a deep breath. She said, "The ringmaster, his name was Mr. Thorne. He did not just measure me for the crowds. He owned me completely." Silas went very still. She said, "He told me that a freak like me should be grateful for any roof over my head. He said no man would ever want me as a wife, so I had to be useful in other ways." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. She said, "He would bring men to my wagon after the shows, rich men who paid extra. They did not want to sleep with me. They wanted to look. They wanted me to undress so they could see how big I was everywhere. They wanted to touch my arms and my legs, to measure me against themselves." Silas felt murderous rage boil up inside him. Hot and white. She continued, "Thorne told me if I did not smile and let them look, he would sell me to a brothel in New Orleans, a place that specialized in oddities. He said they would chain me to a bed there." She looked at Silas with tears standing in her eyes. She said, "So I let them look. I stood there like a statue while they touched me and whispered filthy things in my ears. I let them treat me like a sideshow attraction because the alternative was worse." She trembled. She said, "I am still a virgin, Silas, but not because I am pure or innocent, because I fought. Every single time a man tried to take more than looking, I fought back. I learned that being touched means being used. It means being meat." She wrapped her arms around herself. She said, "That is why I pull away from you. Not because I do not want you, but because my body remembers the fear even when my heart does not." Silas reached out slowly. He moved with deliberate care. He laid his palm against her cheek. His hand was rough and warm and trembling slightly. Alara froze. Her breath caught. She waited for the grab, the pinch, the cruelty, but Silas just held her face. He used his thumb to gently wipe away her tears. He said softly, I am not Thorn, and I am not one of those customers, he said. You are not meat, Alara. You are the fire that kept me warm this winter. You are the strength that held up the burning roof when it fell. She opened her eyes. They were inches apart now. He said, I will never take anything from you. Never. If you want this, if you want me, you have to tell me. I will not touch you past this point unless you ask. Alara looked at him. She saw the restraint in his jaw. She saw the love in his eyes. Not pity, not fascination, real love. She was terrified. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a bird trying to escape a cage. But beneath the fear there was something else. A hunger she had denied for her entire life. A hunger to be known, to be held. She whispered, Silas. She leaned forward. It was a movement of inches, but it felt like crossing a canyon. She said, kiss me. He closed the distance. It was not a smooth kiss. It was clumsy and hesitant. Their noses bumped together. His stubble scraped her chin. But when their lips finally met, the whole world fell away. His mouth was warm and firm. Alara made a small sound, half sob and half sigh. She reached up and gripped his coat. She pulled him closer. The kiss deepened. It became desperate. It tasted of whiskey and salt tears. It was the taste of two starving people finally finding bread. For the first time in her life, Alara forgot she was a giantess. She forgot the circus. She forgot the shame. She was just a woman, and she was wanted. They held each other through the long night. The wind screamed outside, but inside they had found shelter at last. The morning after the storm broke brought silence so deep it felt holy. Silas woke first. His body still ached, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. Alara lay beside him. Her dark hair was spread across the pillow. In sleep, her face was soft and peaceful. He watched her breathe. He memorized the curve of her cheek, the strength of her jaw. Her eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she looked confused. Then she saw him watching her. She smiled. It was a shy, tentative thing. She said, Good morning, he said. Good morning. She said, Is this real, or am I still dreaming? He said, It is real. He reached out and took her hand. He brought it to his lips and kissed her knuckles. He said, I love you, Alara. I should have said it months ago, I love you. She felt tears prick her eyes. She said, I love you too, Silas. They lay there for a long moment just holding hands. Two broken people who had somehow found each other. Then Silas sat up, wincing at his ribs. He said, We still have a problem. Harlan, the debt, the deadline. Alara sat up beside him. She said, I know, but we will face it together. He said, Together. She said, And this time I am not hiding in the cabin. I am coming with you into town. I am done being ashamed of what I am. Silas looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, at the steel in her spine. He smiled. He said, I expected nothing less. They got dressed and stepped out onto the porch. The world was blinding white. The snow had buried everything. Fences were just ripples beneath the drifts, but the sky was clear, a hard, perfect blue. And in the distance, they could see a horse struggling up the road toward them. Help was coming. Justice was coming. And nothing would ever be the same. The rider coming up the road was Martha Gable. She was a 60-year-old widow who ran the ranch to the east. She had buried 2 husbands and shot a cattle rustler from 300 yards. She was wrapped in a buffalo coat and riding a massive plow horse. She pulled up in the yard and spat tobacco juice into a snowbank. She said, You look like you lost a fight with a threshing machine, Silas. He said, I feel about the same. Come inside, Martha. I will make coffee. Over steaming cups, Martha told them what had happened in town. She said, Harlan Boyd's men came back to the saloon at dawn looking half dead. 2 of them have frostbite bad enough to lose toes. One of them has a broken nose. He says he ran into a tree, Alara said quietly. He ran into a fence post. Martha nodded with a grim smile. She said, But that is not all. Harlan is in a rage. He is telling everyone you defaulted Silas. He says the sheriff will evict you as soon as the road's clear. Silas stood up from the table. He said, Then we need to go to town first, before he can spin any more lies. Martha raised an eyebrow. She said, The roads are still half buried in snow, Silas said. I am done hiding. I am done letting Harlan tell the story. They rode into Ironwood 3 hours later. The town was digging itself out. Men were shoveling boardwalks. Shopkeepers were chipping ice from their storefronts. Every shovel stopped when the Vances appeared on the main street. Silas rode the gray mare Bessie. His face was a map of violence, bruises and cuts, and one eye still swollen half shut. But his back was straight, and his eyes were clear. Beside him rode Alara. She sat tall on one of the mules. She wore her heavy coat and a bright scarf wrapped around her throat. Her head was high. For the first time in her life, she did not try to make herself small. She met the stares of the townspeople with calm dignity. They rode directly to the sheriff's office. Harlan Boyd's black stallion was tied out front, along with the horses of the banker and the mayor. Silas dismounted and swayed slightly. Pain radiated up his legs, but he steadied himself. Alara swung down and stood beside him. She towered over everyone on the street. The office door opened. Harlan stepped out onto the boardwalk. Behind him came the sheriff and the banker. Harlan sneered. He said, "Well, look who crawled out of the snow. I was just telling the sheriff, it is time to execute that foreclosure paper." A crowd was gathering now. Store clerks, ranchers, women with market baskets. They sensed something important was happening. Silas stepped up onto the boardwalk. He said loudly, "I am not here about foreclosure. I am here to report a crime." Harlan laughed. He said, "What crime? You failing to pay your debts is not a crime. It is just pathetic," Silas said. "Attempted murder is a crime." The crowd murmured. Silas continued, "Your men ambushed me at the creek crossing. 4 of them. They beat me. They killed my horse. They left me to freeze to death. They said it was a message from you," Harlan said. "That is a lie. You got lost in the storm. You fell off your horse," Silas asked. "Then why are your men nursing broken bones? Why did I find them waiting for me at the exact spot where I would have to cross the creek?" He pointed at his battered face. He said, "Does this look like I fell off a horse, Harlan?" The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. Then Alara stepped forward. The wood of the boardwalk groaned under her weight. She moved past Silas and placed herself between him and Harlan. She looked down at the bully. She said, "Tell them the rest, Harlan." He sneered up at her. He said, "Shut your mouth, freak. No one wants to hear you speak," she said. "Tell them you tried to buy me. Tell them you threatened to foreclose on the ranch unless I agreed to come live in your house, unless I agreed to belong to you." The crowd went completely silent. Alara turned to face the townspeople. She said, "He calls me a monster. Look at me. Yes, I am big. Yes, I am different. I was sold by my own father when I was 14 years old. I was sold to a circus. I was sold to a marriage broker." Her voice grew stronger. She said, "I have been treated like cattle my entire life. But this man wanted to own me not because I am strange. He wanted to own me because he is the monster." She pointed at Harlan. She said, "He wanted to break my husband. He wanted to humiliate us because we dared to survive without his permission." She looked at Harlan with something like pity. She said, "You are small, Harlan. You are so small inside that you have to stand on the necks of others to feel tall." The truth hung in the air. The townspeople looked at Harlan. They saw the rage in his eyes. They saw the bruises on Silas. They remembered years of Harlan pushing his weight around. Harlan saw the tide turning against him. Panic flashed in his eyes. He reached for his gun. It was a foolish, desperate move. Silas reacted on pure instinct. His hand blurred. The pistol was in his grip before Harlan had even cleared leather. He leveled the gun at Harlan's chest. The hammer clicked back. Time froze. Then Alara's hand clamped onto his arm, firm and grounding. She said, "Do not. He is not worth becoming a killer again." Silas looked at her. He saw her steady eyes. He saw her love. He lowered the gun slightly. He said, "Drop it, Harlan." Harlan was trembling with rage and fear. He tried to reholster his weapon, but his hands were shaking too badly. He took a step backward. His boot heel caught on a patch of black ice on the boardwalk. He fell hard off the porch. He landed in the frozen street directly behind his own horse. The black stallion spooked at the sudden movement. It reared up. Its iron hooves came down. Harlan screamed. The horse's hoof struck his leg. The bone shattered with a sickening crack. The animal danced away wild-eyed. Harlan lay in the mud clutching his ruined leg, screaming in agony. Justice had arrived. And it came on 4 hooves. The investigation that followed was swift. The sheriff questioned Harlan's men. One of them, named Pike, confessed to the ambush in exchange for leniency. He admitted Harlan had ordered them to beat Silas badly enough that he would not wake up. The banker from Laramie suddenly discovered a clerical error in the foreclosure paperwork. The deadline was extended by 6 months. Harlan Boyd spent the winter in bed with his shattered leg. His reputation was destroyed. No one in town would look him in the eye anymore. It was not a fairy tale ending. The town did not throw a parade for the giant bride. People still stared sometimes. Children still whispered behind her back. Prejudice is a weed with deep roots. It does not die in a single day. But the malice was gone. When Silas went to the general store, men nodded to him with respect. When Alara walked down the street, people stepped aside. Not out of fear anymore, out of genuine respect. She had stood up to Harlan Boyd. She had saved her husband from freezing to death. She was formidable. Help came quietly in the weeks that followed. Martha Gable sent her hired hands to help rebuild the barn properly. A sack of seed corn appeared on their porch one morning. The blacksmith fixed their plow for free. Spring arrived with a rush of melting water. The snow retreated into the mountains. The creeks turned into roaring torrents of icy water. The grass exploded across the plains in a green so vibrant it hurt the eyes. Silas worked the herd. His ribs healed, though they ached when it rained. He watched the new calves take their first wobbly steps. He watched Alara. She moved through the land with new confidence now. She no longer tried to shrink or hide. She wore dresses she had sewn herself, cut to fit her frame, bright colors that caught the sunlight. One afternoon, a calf got stuck in a mud bog near the river. Silas was reaching for his rope when Alara walked past him. She waded into the muck, laughing as it sucked at her skirts. She scooped up the calf in her arms, 100 pounds of struggling animal. She hauled it to the bank like it weighed nothing at all. She stood there covered in mud, laughing, the calf bleeding in her arms. Silas watched her. His heart swelled until he thought it might burst. She was not a freak. She was a force of nature. Their evenings were quiet and sweet. They would sit on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. They would hold hands. They would talk about the day, about the land, about the future. Silas would read aloud from newspapers or the Bible, his voice low and steady. Alara would sit on the rug with his head resting in her lap. Her fingers would comb gently through his hair. By late autumn, the signs of their future were undeniable. Alara's dresses were let out at the waist. She moved a little slower. She placed her hand on her stomach often, a look of wonder on her face. A child was coming, a child made not from a business transaction, but from love. Christmas Eve in the year 1884, the winter had returned, but it was gentle this year. Snow dusted the ground in a thin white blanket. The air was cold but still. Silas and Alara sat on the porch bench, wrapped together in a buffalo robe. The sky above them was a canopy of stars. Cold and bright and beautiful, the land stretched away in blue shadows. Peaceful at last, Silas said. It has been a year since the storm. Alara nodded. She said, a year since you almost died. A year since I found my reason for living. He turned to look at her. The starlight made her face glow soft and silver. He said, you know, I still remember that night, when I was half frozen and delirious. I tried to tell you how I felt, but all the wrong words came out. She laughed, that deep, rich sound that he loved so much. She said, you were a babbling fool. He grinned. He said, I was a desperate man trying to tell you I needed you more than air. I just chose the worst possible words. She leaned her head against his shoulder. She said, they were the right words, because they were yours, and because for the first time in my life, I did not feel like merchandise being sold. I felt like a woman being chosen. He kissed the top of her head. He said, I choose you, Alara, every single day. Every morning when the sun comes up, every night when the wind blows, I choose you. She placed his hand on her rounded belly. She said, And soon there will be three of us to choose. He felt movement beneath his palm, a tiny kick, a small life growing inside the woman he loved. He said, "Do you think the baby will be tall?" She laughed again. She said, "I certainly hope so. This world needs more people who can reach the high shelves." They sat in comfortable silence watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. They were not perfect people. They were scarred and broken in places that would never fully heal. Silas still woke up sometimes sweating from nightmares of gunfire. Ilara still flinched when strangers laughed too loudly. They were an odd pair, the lonely cowboy and his giant bride. But sitting there on that porch rooted in their own land, holding each other against the vast indifferent darknesses of the Wyoming winter, they knew one thing with absolute certainty. They had won. They had survived. And they were not alone anymore. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope the journey of Silas and Ilara touched your heart the way it touched mine while telling it. These two people started out as strangers thrown together by desperation. She was sold like property. He was drowning in debt, in loneliness. The world called her a monster. The world called him a failure. But they found something precious in each other. They found acceptance. They found courage. They found love. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a comment below. Tell me where you are listening from. Tell me what you thought of the ending, and remember this lesson from the Wyoming frontier. The people who call others monsters are usually the real monsters themselves. The people who seem strange or different might be the strongest and most beautiful souls you will ever meet. And sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. Thank you for your time. Until next time, stay warm out there.